Good morning, Internet. It is still morning, and I'm making this right after I made episode 1. So nothing has changed other than I've had more coffee. Anywho, Everyman Library, Pride and Prejudice. We're on chapter 2. To summarize chapter 1, we're introduced to the Bennets. Bingley is coming to Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet is having a freak out because she needs Mr. Bennet to introduce them. And we did a quick history lesson about why it was so important for women of that era to get married. All right, chapter 2. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go. Until the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter employed in trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We're not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit." "But you forget, Mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long has promised to introduce him." Again, Mrs. Long has met Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Bennet does not know that Mr. Bennet has gone to Bingley's place, met him, so now Mr. Bennet can act as the introduction between Mrs. Bennet, the girls, and Mr. Bingley. But now that Mrs. Long has met, when they go to the assemblies, then Mrs. Bennet will use Mrs. Long to introduce the girls to Mr. Bingley. Following all that? "I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 sisters of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her." "No more than I," said Mr. Bennet, "and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving you." Mrs. Bennet designed not to make any reply, but unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. Have a little compassion on my nerves." We're always talking about Mrs. Bennet's nerves. Like, what the fuck is up with that? "You tear them to pieces." "Kitty has no discretion in her coughs," said her father. "She times them ill." "I do not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty fretfully. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "Tomorrow fortnight." 2 weeks. "Aye, so it is," cried her mother, "and Mrs. Long does not come back to the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself." Okay, interestingly, we are told in the beginning, unless I misunderstood this, that Mrs. Long has met Mr. Bingley or will be meeting Mr. Bingley before Mrs. Bennet and the girls and the assembly. So either I'm misreading this or Jane kind of got the timeline a little screwed. So take that what you will. "Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend and introduce Mr. Bingley to her." "Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible. When I am not acquainted with him myself, how can you be so teasing? I honor your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will, and after all, Mrs. Long and her nieces must stand their chance, and therefore, as she will think of it as an act of kindness, if you decline the office, I will take it upon myself." The girls stared at their father. Mrs. Bennet said only, "Nonsense, nonsense." "What can the meaning of the emphatic exclamation?" cried he. "Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books and make extracts." Interestingly, if we recall in chapter 1, Mr. Bennet comments that Lizzie is the only one that has any sort of sense, and that his other daughters are flighty and giggly and, what teenagers do. But here he is referencing Mary that she is of deep reflection. So she's not like how he had referred to all of his daughters other than Lizzie in chapter 1. Mary wished to say something very sensible, but knew not how. While Mary is adjusting her ideas, he continued, "Let us return to Mr. Bingley." "I am sick of Mr. Bingley," cried his wife. "I am sorry to hear that. But why did not you tell me so before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlucky, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished. That teaser always, Mr. Bennet. That of Mrs. Bennet perhaps surpassing the rest, though when the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that if it was what she had expected all the while. "How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet, but I know I should persuade you at last. I assure you loved your girls too, well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am. And it's such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now. Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose, said Mr. Bennet, and as he spoke, he left the rooms, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. I'm sorry, but when I hear the word raptures, I think of that scene in Pride and Prejudice 2005 when Darcy makes a comment to Caroline that he will endeavor her raptures when he's writing to Georgina or Georgiana. I don't know what. Yes, you should know I am a big fan of 2005. Hand flex, the whole 9 yards, my jam. So if you have an issue with that, I am not the person you should be watching. What an excellent father you have, girl, said she, when that door was shut. I do not know how you will ever make amends for his kindness, or me either, for that matter. At our time of life, it is not so pleasant. I can tell you to be making new acquaintances every day, but for your sakes would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball. Oh, said Lydia stoutly, I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I am the tallest. That is interesting because if I'm recalling both the movies and the BBC adaptation, Lydia was kind of on the short side. The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon he would return Mr. Bennet's visit and determining when they should ask him to dinner. End of chapter 2. So we're not really learning that much other than a few things that I have pointed out that seem to conflict with what Jane had written in chapter 1. But we are given the setting that Mr. Bennet has now gone and introduced himself to Mr. Bingley. He has teased his wife and his daughters. Mary is having deep reflection. Lydia is being Lydia all over the place. So there's not really much to discuss here other than Jane is now in the process of setting up the storyline, as well as she's giving us an idea of how the Bennets work as a family. So that's it for chapter 2. I will see you next week for chapter 3.